Hello, YouTube fan. Get ready for an amazing video experience. Welcome to our channel, where today's focus is all about international volunteering. Let's get started. International volunteering is when volunteers contribute their time to work for organizations or causes outside their home countries. International volunteering has a long association with international development or environment, with the aim of bringing benefits to host communities. It can include a range of services, from healthcare advancement to economic development to governance. Trends show that international volunteering has become increasingly popular across many countries over the past few decades. International volunteering is a broad term which is used to capture multi-year, skilled placements as well as short-term roles. The term voluntourism has become common to describe certain types of volunteering organized by governments, charities, and travel agents. In this chapter, we'll be shedding light on history and its role in shaping our understanding. On a large scale, walk camps after World War I and early missionary service were the first expressions of international service. Formal overseas volunteering can be traced back over 100 years to when the British Red Cross set up the Voluntary Aid Detachment VAD scheme in 1909. The VAD volunteers, as well as volunteers from many other national Red Cross organizations, worked in battlefields across Europe and the Middle East during World War I to treat soldiers and civilians regardless of the side they fought for. One of the most prominent organizations, Service Civil International, organized walk camps from 1920 on as a form of post-war reconciliation and was formally established in 1934. Up to the mid-20th century, overseas volunteering projects were mainly undertaken by people with direct connections to a particular cause and were considered more as short-term in nature. The more formal inception of international volunteering organizations can be linked to organizations such as Australian Volunteers International, formerly the Volunteer Graduate Scheme, which formed in 1951. International Voluntary Services in 1953 in the United States, and Voluntary Services Overseas VSO in 1958, the United Kingdom. These services and that of the U.S. Peace Corps, established in 1961 during the Kennedy administration, paved the way for broader recognition of overseas volunteering in later years. During the ERS and ERS, a movement of volunteerism and study abroad programs became popular among university students and graduates, and the United Nations launched the UN Volunteers Program for young professionals to take part in a long-term 2-year-plus overseas program. In the late 20th century, there was also a notable emergence of medical international volunteering in response to the lack of qualified healthcare personnel in developing countries. This called for the employment of doctors and nurses in third world countries, practicing Western medicine in non-Western environments. The growing interest in international volunteering was facilitated, in part, by globalization, as it fostered cross-cultural exchange, collaboration, and networking among all parties involved. It also played a pivotal role in the increased sense of global connectivity and awareness of health disparities and humanitarian needs. Global health initiatives underwent a shift from disease-specific interventions to the advancement of internal healthcare systems. This change was brought about by an increased presence of non-communicable diseases rooted in unhealthy diets, substance abuse, physical inactivity, and exposure to unclean and hazardous energy sources. At this time, the World Health Organization (WHO) rapidly diverted energy to revitalizing efforts that would effectively bolster health systems. Volunteering with organizations such as Global Medical Brigades exemplified goals of the WHO and were increasingly sought after by undergraduate students, medical students, and healthcare professionals. In recent years, the accessibility of international volunteering for U.S. Americans has increased significantly, with many smaller charities connecting volunteers with non-governmental organizations in developing countries. About half of all international volunteering from the U.S. takes place through faith-based organizations. For-profit travel companies have also increasingly been offering paid-for volunteering opportunities. This growth coincided with the increasing number of young people taking gap years and has been termed volunteer tourism and voluntourism to denote shorter-term voluntary work that is not necessarily the sole purpose of the trip. However, many opportunities, medium and long-term opportunities for skilled international volunteers remain. For example, the publicist role of volunteers in addressing the Ebola virus epidemic in West Africa. According to U.S. Current Population Survey, the most common activities volunteers engage in abroad include tutoring or teaching, mentoring youth, engaging in general labor, and providing counseling, medical care, or protective services. As we transition to the next segment, let's unravel the mysteries surrounding limited volunteer demographics and gain a fresh perspective. Global statistics on international volunteers are unavailable. However, about 1 million people from the US volunteer abroad each year, almost half for less than 2 weeks. Shorter-term voluntourism is therefore appealing to many, as it is targeted at travelers who want to make a positive change in the world, while still providing a touristic experience. Volunteering appeals to a broad cross-section of society, but the majority of volunteers are in their 20s and 30s, potentially due to perceptions of volunteering abroad being a more risky activity. The average age of voluntary service overseas VSO volunteers, however, is 38, showing a broad range of participation across age groups. Recently there has been an increase in baby boomer volunteers. One possible explanation for the increase is that these people are transitioning into a new stage of life and their focus may shift toward finding activities that give their life new meaning. As with domestic volunteering, international volunteering is more common among those with a higher education and from higher income households. Let's now turn our attention to critiques and challenges and examine its role within a larger context. Certain critiques and challenges are associated with international volunteering. As we enter this new chapter, let's navigate the complexities of outcomes and unravel its multifaceted nature. Measuring the outcomes of international volunteering is an ongoing challenge. Sometimes the costs invested in these partnerships are high. The intangible nature of impact and outcomes is hard to measure, and research has been proposed in this area. Similarly, how to measure the success of a volunteer and the supporting organization's performance is complicated. To allow volunteers to integrate properly into the community, it is essential that volunteers have some useful skills and are reasonably well informed and trained before the placement. Shannon O'Donnell, a vocal critic of poorly designed international programs, contends that many volunteer organizations compromise the dignity of local populations, so these programs often foster cyclical dependency on international volunteers within the communities the programs are designed to serve. Others have critiqued the mixing of models of volunteering designed for international understanding and those designed for social or economic development. Still others are concerned about its post-colonial and historical character, and the impacts this has on the identity of members of hosting communities. Prepare yourself for an eye-opening discussion on high costs in the upcoming portion of this video. Related to the impact of international volunteering, the cost of having an international volunteer has been cited as another area of concern, especially costs for air tickets, allowances such as for housing and food, insurance, training and logistics. Local staff do not require long-distance travel costs, although they do require payment, and the local organizations could put these funds into other activities. However, many volunteers pay these expenses personally. Some institutions provide scholarships for international volunteering. Still, volunteers are often cheaper than other forms of long-term technical assistance because they live and work under local conditions. Expatriates who work in the same capacity can be paid multiple times more than any allowances volunteers receive, if any. The cost-benefit of international volunteers is hard to quantify, though studies have highlighted improvements in well-being and intercultural understanding in communities and schools as a result of international exchanges and volunteers. Let's now turn our gaze towards undermining local organizations and explore the fascinating connections it has to offer. One consideration is that volunteers may dominate the local workplace, replace local employment, and undermine management and work culture, especially in small organizations and schools. This is due to volunteers often being considered more highly educated than local staff, even if they do not often have much direct experience. Coming from a different culture can also lead to volunteers imposing their values on organizations. For example, different cultures have different ideas on whether it is more important to finish a project by a deadline or to be active in the social life of the community, and a person who values punctuality may be annoyed that work stops for a funeral, while the person who values the community may be annoyed at the heartless-seeming person who wants to skip the funeral. Similarly, different cultures have different values about some business matters, with differing ideas about where the line is drawn between impermissible levels of nepotism and building valuable relationships and endorsements. Volunteers are often trained to respect the local working culture and ethics. Since they report directly to local organizations, they can and sometimes do have their contracts terminated if they break any local regulations, which helps to reduce concerns of domination. Let's now turn our gaze towards low skills and experience and explore the fascinating connections it has to offer. Young and inexperienced international volunteers sometimes do not have the correct skills to achieve the project goal. While this may be fine for volunteer workshops and volunteer trips designed around enhancing international and intercultural understanding, it is a significant problem for international development volunteering (IDV). On the other hand, many of the most prominent international volunteer cooperation organizations, especially those funded by governments, have minimal educational and skill requirements. Our focus now turns to poor understandings of local context, an important aspect of our discussion. International volunteers from outside the host community can lack an understanding of the local context. While there is often a vetting or selection process for volunteers before they are recruited to serve in developing countries, this process has at times been found wanting. Large international volunteer cooperation organizations provide their volunteers with significant training before and often their placement, which can help address this deficit. On the other hand, countless smaller and for-profit IFUs offering unskilled volunteer placements to any participant willing to pay the placement fee rarely provide the type of training and preparation that volunteers need to be successful and helpful in hosting communities. In these circumstances, there is conflict about whether the fees volunteers pay justify the time spent supervising and revising their work, and if a sufficient portion of the fees make it back to the local communities hosting volunteers who are typically responsible for their supervision and training. In this section, we'll be peeling back the layers of neo-colonialism to reveal its true essence. There have been allegations from some quarters of neo-colonial advances disguised as an effort to tackle poverty, as some volunteer organizations are connected to national governments, e.g. the Peace Corps, which was set up by the American government. Despite this challenge, most volunteer organizations are non-governmental NGOs and are not influenced by government policies. The present structures of international volunteering are also often aimed at impacts on a local, community scale, which is sharply in contrast with the macro-political government strategies of the colonial era. However, many academic journals elaborate that volunteers often have little knowledge or expertise in the work they do when volunteering abroad. This has raised concerns of its value. Francis Brown and Derek Hall write that this creates a neo-colonial narrative. They say the volunteer perspective is framed around the idea that Westerners with minimal experience can effect change in the global South, just by nature of being from the West. This perpetuates the narrative of Western domination in a post-colonial world, and the need to save and help the global South. Get ready for a thought-provoking discussion as we delve into motivations of volunteers and its impact on our understanding. People volunteer for many reasons, but seldom does anyone volunteer strictly for monetary reasons, as very few organizations offer a stipend for volunteering. More compelling motives include experiencing another culture, meeting new people, and advancing one's career prospects. Such motivations are common among younger volunteers who are looking for experience or direction in their careers. People generally volunteer in order to increase their international awareness, to contextualize poverty and its effects as an education opportunity, and to help people while having a morally rewarding experience. Many believe that the trip will change the way they think when they return home. However, others are just looking to give to others and do not believe that their experience will cause them to think twice about their lives back home. Many participants use these trips to boost their resumes, travel with friends, gain world experience, and see new countries. A common motivation is to make a difference and to achieve something positive for others who are less fortunate than the volunteer. Many volunteers tend to concur that there are disadvantaged people in their home countries, but the scale of disadvantage outside their home countries is felt to be greater. Volunteering at home may elicit images of helping the less fortunate or campaigning with a local pressure group. Volunteering abroad has tended to be associated with international development and bridging the divide between the rich and poor worlds. Volunteering abroad often seems a more worthy contribution in this context to the volunteers than work in their own country. This perspective is particularly true of volunteers who are older and looking for something more value-based as they near the end of their professional careers or after their children have left home. It is argued that volunteers are categorized by their motivation based on 6 main criteria: destination, duration of project, focus of experience, self-interest versus altruistic, qualifications, active versus passive participation, and level of contribution to locals. Certain data has encouraged researchers to propose a conceptual structure of volunteers, classifying them as shallow, intermediate, and deep. The latter represented those who are prone to volunteer due to the hosting community's needs, suggesting an authentic motivation of wanting to provide aid where it's needed. A shallow and intermediate volunteer is more so dominated by personal interests, with intermediate suggesting both altruistic and authentic motives. In the next phase, we'll be immersing ourselves in the realm of voluntourism or volunteer tourism and exploring its real-world applications. Voluntourism or volunteer tourism. Now, let's shift our perspective and explore definition from a different angle. Volunteer tourism, also known as voluntourism, is a specific kind of international volunteering. It is a relatively new concept, combining the nonprofit sector and the tourism sector. Essentially, it is a form of international traveling to resource-poor settings, with a primary purpose of volunteering and serving the host community. Voluntourism activities are generally temporary attempts to address education, health, environmental and economic issues. Ideally, voluntourism activities are conducted by non-profit organizations for the purpose of societal good and poses a chance for volunteers to help and benefit others in an unconventional setting with their skills. Those activities are characterized by the age of the participants and by the length of time they volunteer abroad. Participants are often young adults' ages. The length of the trip is often categorized as short-term, under 3 months. And the volunteering is regularly packaged with adventure and travel activities. Voluntourism has undergone intense scrutiny over the course of the years, and an increasing number of academic papers question volunteer tourists' motivations and experiences. As we enter this new phase, let's navigate the complexities of growth of voluntourism and discover its practical applications. As a variation of international volunteering, voluntourism's development can be traced back to over a century ago. According to National Public Radio, it is one of the most rapid growing trends in modern travel, with more than 1.6 million volunteer tourists spending around $2 billion each year. Get ready for a thought-provoking discussion as we delve into criticisms and its impact on our understanding. Voluntourism programs are more often conducted by profit-making companies rather than charities. Although the intention for volunteers to travel is to empower the local communities, the ultimate motivation of the volunteers is more self-serving. According to a study done by Rebecca Thiessen, the motivations identified by the participants generally fit under the category of personal growth, e.g. skill development, cross-cultural understanding, career choice, etc., while motivations related to having a positive social impact or desire for social justice in the host communities was not found among the participants, reflecting a one-directional flow of benefits from the host communities to the volunteers. With this trend, communities, journalists, and those who have actually done volunteer activities start to question to which extent voluntourism activities can actually help with the local condition, or will they actually bring harm to the already underprivileged places. Volunteer sending organisations, such as Free the Children's Meterwee Trips, the British company Projects Abroad, and AIESEC, have been critiqued as furthering the aforementioned neo-colonial narrative to youth. The increased prevalence of promotional material regarding trips to help the Global South has increased media exposure in the Global North to poverty in the Global South. Critics argue that the way in which these organizations advertise their trips stigmatize and frames the developing world as helpless. This plays into Maria Erickson-Boz's theories in the book Paternalism of Partnership, a postcolonial reading of identity in development aid, in which she discusses discourse that frames the volunteer as a developed, paternalistic individual and the donor as underdeveloped. The framing and othering of cultures outside the West and Global North can also be found in Edward Said's text, Orientalism. His theory is rooted in the same idea, in which he describes West's patronizing portrayals of the East. Other criticisms of the voluntourism industry are that not only are short-term volunteers often untrained in the projects they participate in, building schools, health centers, wells, but that projects can fuel conflicts among communities, offer band-aid solutions, replace work locals could be doing, and reinforce neoliberal policies. Interactions with children are highly popular amongst voluntourism programs. As a consequence, children in these communities may become dependent and commodified when volunteers are constantly arriving and departing every couple weeks. Orphanage volunteering is also an emerging program, which can fuel human trafficking or child abuse in the host communities and harm the children's development. According to UNICEF, in Nepal, 85% of all children living in orphanages has at least one living parent. Campaigning organization Orphanages Not the Solution, based in Cambodia, estimates that 3/4 of children in orphanages in the country are not orphans. They claim that orphanage numbers have increased as a direct result of volunteer tourism, with orphanages training children to attract foreign donors for income. The rhetoric of such volunteer-sending organizations has also been argued to inform a consumer capitalist culture that plays to the wants and needs of the privileged North, at the disadvantage of the Global South. Remember to follow me on social media for behind-the-scenes content and updates.